You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology. And this is This Week in Cardiology for September 28, 2018. This week I'm talking the COAPT trial, omega-3s, VEST trial, renal denervation, and new competition in the drug-eluting stent market. The biggest news this week, perhaps this year, was the astonishing, stunning, knock-you-off-your-chair results of COAPT. COAPT, an RCT comparing the MitraClip device plus medical therapy versus medical therapy alone for patients with heart failure, reduced EF, and secondary MR. Now, while French investigators reported a decidedly negative MITRA-FR trial just a month ago, COAPT trialists reported an NNT for the primary endpoint heart failure hospital admissions of 3 and an NNT of 6 for all-cause death at 2 years for the MitraClip. Now, for comparison, the NNTs for ICDs is about 14 to 20, so these are remarkable results. 2 trials on similar patients with the same device now reside in the New England Journal of Medicine. The trialist at TCT, where COAPT was presented, explained the astonishing results and huge differences in the 2 trials by saying that COAPT enrolled patients in the sweet spot. Basically, the mitral regurgitation was severe, but the left ventricle was not yet blown out. The problem, of course, is that these very small differences in baseline characteristics hardly explained the stunning and astonishing results. Now, I want to be clear, the COAPT trial was positive, and there's no doubt about that. This may indeed be a viable option for some patients. Dr. Greg Stone, the PI of COAPT, estimated that it would be about 10% of all heart failure patients who might benefit from the MitraClip. But again, please, the discrepant results between the 2 trials warrants caution. There is good news, however. A 3rd trial is coming, and it's called Reshape Heart Failure 2, and this will likely be a tiebreaker between the 2. Now, we have a bunch of content on the MitraClip and COAPT trials. Patrice Wendling has a complete recap. I wrote a column on it, and I also have an interview with Bobby Ye, an interventional cardiologist from Beth Israel Hospital, and we talked about the trial for a few minutes at TCT. Next topic, speaking of surprises, I've reported here on a systematic review from Cochrane and the recent Ascend trial, and both of these showed no cardiovascular benefit from the addition of omega-3s. Well, this week, a press release from Amarin, the makers of a high-dose EPA supplement called Vasepta, said their capsule reduced major adverse cardiac events in an RCT called REDUCE-IT. They said that the relative risk reduction of the composite primary endpoint, which was CV death, non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, revascularization, or unstable angina, was announced to be about 25%. During a company conference call, the CEO referred to the benefit of the high-dose EPA as huge and exceeding all expectations, comparing it to that seen with atorvastatin. Entry into the REDUCE-IT trial required LDL levels of about 41 to 100, and patients had to have persistently elevated triglyceride levels. The trial will be presented at AHA, and I will wait to reserve comment until we see the data. I mean, this is a press release from the company. There is much to know about this. For instance, the most basic thing to know is what were the drivers of the primary endpoint. Was it death or stroke, or was it the softer endpoints like unstable angina or revascularization? The other thing to notice about this announcement is the psychology and marketing side of it. In other words, Amarin has now controlled the story. Yes, they have a positive finding, so we therefore start the American Heart Association meeting with the idea that it is positive, and the question remains, how positive? This is called anchoring. It's what salespeople do when they set a higher price to which to negotiate from. It's really unbecoming of impartial science, I think. Third topic today is about the wearable cardiac defibrillator. After more than 15 years that the wearable cardiac defibrillator, WCD, has been available, we now have results of the first RCT called the VEST trial, which was published in New England Journal of Medicine this week. This was post-MI patients who had significant left ventricular dysfunction. It was the wearable cardiac defibrillator versus standard medical therapy. The primary endpoint was arrhythmic death. The VEST trial included 2,300 patients randomized in a 2-to-1 fashion, followed for about 3 months. Arrhythmic death occurred in 25 patients in the device group, 1.6%, and 19 patients in the control group, 2.4%. The hazard ratio was 0.67, but the confidence intervals ranged from 0.37 to 1.2, and the p-value was 0.18. And so the lower rate of arrhythmic death in the wearable cardiac defibrillator group did not reach statistical significance. Not even close, really. Now, death from any cause was 3.1% in the device arm and 4.9% in the control arm. And that hazard ratio of 0.64 did meet statistical significance, with the upper limit of the confidence interval at 0.98. Now, I stand by the post that I wrote when VEST was presented earlier this year. I think the primary endpoint of arrhythmic death is appropriate here. This is because the wearable cardiac defibrillator is designed to prevent death from arrhythmia. That's what it does. It's only what it does. So let's get a bit nuanced on this. Dr. Jeremy Sussman, a health outcomes researcher at the University of Michigan, said on Twitter that the VEST trial was harmed by optimistic flaws. 1, poor enrollment, since doctors are sure an untested treatment works. 2nd, poor adherence, and investigators missed their treatment burden. And 3rd, lower event rates, so you must power for improvement over time. Now, let's talk about each one of these. First, let's talk about poor enrollment, because doctors are sure the treatment works. Now, this surprises me because if you like evidence, we have 2 RCTs, Dynamit and IRAS, which have shown that a real ICD, one that works all day long, did not provide benefit early after MI. So why would anybody think that a defibrillator, a wearable defibrillator, which is worn in the best cases only part of the day, do any better? The Bayesian view, therefore, of the priors would be that the WCD, wearable cardiac defibrillator, would not provide benefit. Second point I'll make is on adherence. In the trial, it was shown that many of the deaths occurred while not wearing the device. And that tempts one to think, oh, if only they could wear the thing more. Now, hopefully you can see the problem with that. Poor adherence relates to the burdensome nature of the wearable cardiac defibrillator. I mean, pretend that you had a wonder drug, but then you could only swallow it part of the time. It wouldn't be so wondrous. Third issue is low event rates. Now, low event rates are a problem with lots of new trials. There are secular trends that show lower event rates over time. Background medical therapy is getting better. This means that it's harder for any new therapy to lower event rates further. The control group had a primary endpoint rate of 2.4%. That's hard to lower much more. Now, the call to have larger trials in essence means that any effect size of the therapy you're testing has got to be smaller. So finally, some final comments. Although you can almost always say that benefit cannot be ruled out from a non-significant trial, this is the best we're probably going to get with the wearable cardiac defibrillator, and it's non-significant. What I hope happens going forward is that we get smarter about the use of the wearable cardiac defibrillator. What happens much too often now is that the device is ordered with little thought, little discussion with the patient. Much of this occurs because of fear-based marketing. I hope that the VEST trial brings some sanity to how best to take care of people after myocardial infarction. And here's another tougher question, and it really is a question. Since we now have large RCT-level evidence, and per the final sentence in the New England Journal, quote, the wearable cardiac defibrillator did not result in significantly lower rate of arrhythmic death than medical therapy during the first 90 days. Who, I ask, will pay for this expensive device? Is it right to ask society to pay for a device that was tested and did not stand up to the RCT? And if the wearable cardiac defibrillator were a drug, would it be approved? And what happens to healthcare budgets if we say unproven therapies can garner thousands of dollars? Again, these are questions. Next topic is renal denervation. 2 trials presented at TCT addressed renal denervation for resistant hypertension. Now, renal denervation has been on a bit of a roller coaster. First, we had widespread hype and promise. Then, a negative Simplicity 3 trial. But recently, a couple smaller trials with narrower patient population and different techniques to ablate in the renal arteries shows some promise. Patrice Wendling, my colleague at the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, has written another terrific recap. Her other from TCT was the COAPT summary. Both of these pieces are excellent. So here's the bottom line. 2 trials, one of them positive and published in Circulation. The other, a sham-controlled trial, stopped for futility, and it's not yet published. Hopefully it will be someday so that we don't have publication bias. The positive trial is called radiosound hypertension, and it enrolled patients with resistant hypertension to either one of 3 groups. First group, radiofrequency ablation in the main renal arteries, then RF ablation in the main and peripheral arteries, and then an endovascular ultrasound device that used to do renal ablation in the main artery. The primary endpoint was a change in systolic ambulatory blood pressure at 3 months. They had about 40 patients in each group, and overall, in the entire study group, blood pressure did go down by about 10, and the endovascular device was slightly better when compared to RF only in the main renal arteries, but it was not significantly better than RF in the main plus peripheral arteries. The trial that was stopped for futility was called Reduced Hypertension Reinforced Trial, which used a Boston Scientific ablation device. It was versus a sham, and there was no difference at 8 weeks. So here are a few comments. As noted by Dr. Deepak Bhatt in the news story, that he was the PI of the Simplicity 3 trial. Renal denervation trials have become hard to recruit for. Why? Because resistant hypertension turns out to be not very resistant when patients are enrolled in a well-run hypertension clinic. That's really an important point. I also agree with Dr. Bhatt's comment when he said renal denervation is not ready for the real world yet. Rather, we still need larger trials to pinpoint the effect size, to see which sort of patients benefit, and to see how durable this effect will be. I would also add to his comments that we should also have outcome data, because remember, blood pressure is a measurement, not a disease. Now, of course, it's become clear to me that an ablative procedure in the kidneys is never going to vanquish regular, run-of-the-mill high blood pressure. But I have patients who have tough-to-control blood pressure on multiple meds, who are actually taking multiple meds, who don't have a secondary cause, and maybe even they have AFib. I am cautiously optimistic that this procedure may help a small fraction of patients with this type of scenario. So therefore, renal denervation is worth pursuing, but alas, it won't likely be the blockbuster that industry had hoped for. Next topic is about competition in interventional cardiology. Let's just switch to drugs for a second. If you have 2 drugs, one generic and one branded, and they have equal efficacy and equal side effects, you go with the generic because it's less expensive. I think it's just dumb to burn money. Now, what if this concept came to the stent market, which is now dominated by the drug-eluting stent called Xience? At TCT, UK-led investigators reported results of the Talent trial. This was an RCT of an Indian-made drug-eluting stent called a Superflex that was done in 23 European centers. Xience is proved very tough to compete with because it has really good outcomes. But the Indian-made Superflex proved non-inferior in a very solid test with a p-value for non-inferiority of less than 0.001. The translation is that these were very similar results. Now, this could be a huge breakthrough for the billions of patients in countries with lower healthcare budgets than the U.S. I think it would be a great option here, too. But here's an interesting thing. An interventional cardiologist at TCT bemoaned the results because, sit down for this, it could drive down prices of stents. Now, why is lowering the price of a medical device a bad thing? Well, because, he said, less profits for industry could mean less incentive to innovate. Well, I want to push back on that respectfully. I think price competition is a good thing for patients and for society at large. I can't wait to see this study published, and I wonder whether the company will seek approval in the U.S., and I think, in general, price competition and driving prices lower is the natural order, and it's a good thing. I want to make an announcement before I close. I will take a week off next week. This Week in Cardiology will skip a week. I'm very excited and proud to be going to southern Poland, Rzeszów, southern Poland, to give a number of lectures. And I won't be available to do This Week in Cardiology, but it will return the week after. So I'll see you then. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful that you did. This is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.